We are going to, this one's going to be a long recording. We're going to go as close to 12:30 as possible, and we're just going to cover as much as we can until that point. Okay, so any questions about what we've covered on business analysis, planning, and monitoring so far before I cover the last two sections and some techniques that we kind of cover at the time that we're covering BAPM? Okay, let's move through this. Okay, BA information management. So when I say BA information, if BA information is the combination of everything we as business analysts work on. So it's all the stuff we do. It's our models, it's our lists of requirements, it's the way we connect all of it together, all kinds of stuff. All of that stuff that we put together to help us move through that process and ultimately get to a solution, that's all our BA information. Now the purpose of this task is that we document how business analysis information is going to be kept. Where are we going to keep it? How are we going to access it? So this is about making sure that we are consistent with that. The elements of this task, and we'll talk about each one of these, is how do we organize that information? We're going to talk a little bit about levels of abstraction. We'll talk about that again later, but we're going to talk about what is that idea in this task. We'll talk about how we're going to plan how we trace and use requirements over and over. We're going to talk about how we store and access, and then what kind of attributes. We're going to talk about how we plan attributes that we store about our requirements. So when we're thinking about all of this, and when we're trying to decide what's the structure, how's it going to work, one of the elements we think about is what kind of information are we getting together, and how are we documenting it, so, and how much of it is there. That's going to impact how we choose to store it. We also want to know what kind of access are we going to give stakeholders? How are they going to use that information? If all they're going to do is consume a requirements document from us, so let's say that in my world, I have an actual requirements management tool. So I work in an organization that implements a specific type of solution at multiple companies. Now, while every company and every stakeholder is different, they have a lot of similarities on what they need from the kind of solution we offer. So I can reuse requirements all over the place. So I have, because of that, I design my requirements, my BA information and the tool by which and how I store it, I design it in a way that it's easy for me to pull in reusable requirements. And I have different kinds of stakeholders. I have some stakeholders that are internal that are going to actually implement these requirements, and they need constant access directly to the requirements, maybe not to update them, but to consume them. My customers are remote, so I might just provide them an output, a report, right? They don't need to have direct access. Maybe they do. Maybe I get them into a user portal by which they can consume the requirements for approval and document and commenting purposes, right? So thinking about how am I going to interact with these people? Also the size and complexity of the project. The bigger the project, the more you're going to document, the more you're going to need to be structured in how you store it, right? So thinking about those things is going to impact how you're going to manage, document, store your information. So while you're figuring that out, those are the kind of things you're going to think about. Now there's an element of business analysis that's really powerful, and this is where we start thinking about how do we create layers of abstraction, levels of detail, right? So first we need to think about what's the breadth and depth of what we're working on. And then we need to store, document, think about those things in a way that we have differing levels for different groups, but without you having to create multiple copies of the same kind of documentation, but with slightly different elements, right? So it's important that we use techniques and we document in a way that allows us to reuse, trace, and generate different views based on the people I'm working with. So layers of abstraction. A good example is business process flow versus business process model. Business process flows don't give you layers of abstraction. Your detail is your detail because it goes a long ways, and And then so you'll have a process flow, and then it'll stop on this piece of paper and it'll pick up on the next piece of paper, and it just continually goes, and it's linear in its progression. A business process model, which implies three-dimensional, will have a high-level view of the process, and then each one of those boxes on that process has a little plus sign, and you click that little plus sign and it digs deeper into that specific area of the process, and then that might have some boxes that dig deeper. And so that allows me the opportunity to, in one set, I have one full set of understanding of the business process, but I might only give that top layer to executives. I might give the middle layer to middle management while still giving them the understanding of that top layer. And then I give all the detailed stuff, that lowest level of detail, to the people that actually have to click buttons. But I only give it to them for the specific functional area that impacts them. And so that's the value, that's the power of levels of abstraction. I can create these layers that tell one story, but I can pick out the layer or the level of detail that's appropriate for that specific audience. And that's a powerful element that a business analyst should be capable of generating. So for example, at a really high level, this is what the process looks like for sending and receiving messages. Let's say this is email. I have the sender who sends a message to a receiver, but I might dig down into this, might get more detail about what does that sender do before it hits this spot, and then this messages, the transferring of the message, what does that involve? This might have another layer underneath it, right? So this is a really high level of abstraction, but if I were to dig into each one of these, I would have a lot more boxes that talk about a lot more things with a lot more arrows that give me a different layer of detail. So that's abstraction, right? And if I were to give significant detail to an executive, how are they likely to respond? Okay, you're fading in and out on me. What was that? There you go. Right. And so then what do they do? They check out, right? Yeah. You lose their attention, and then they're actually potentially building a resistance to you approaching them again. Right? So it's important to understand your audience and know what level of abstraction you need to share with them. Okay. Now, traceability. This is an art that a lot of organizations do not do. Okay. So first thing, you have to decide, am I even doing it? Am I going to trace? If I am, what does that look like, right? And it could be based on the specific project or change that you're working on, but honestly, if you're tracing in your environment and you want traceability to be usable or useful, you probably should be doing it on everything, and it should be centralized. But if you're doing it just, if you're approaching traceability from a change specific perspective, then if you're working on a change that's not really complex, traceability gets too expensive for value. The value is not there. But if you're doing a really risky, high complex change, traceability can become invaluable. It's a very, very, very good risk mitigator. Okay, so first you got to decide, am I going to trace? Based on the complexity of the project or the change will probably determine that for you. I also want to think about the number of views I'm going to be producing. How many layers of abstraction am I going to do? That will help me determine how many layers of traceability am I going to need. And then the other thing we think about is the impacts of not having it. So again, if this is high, your risk is high. If this is low, your risk is low. And when you think about that, that can help you decide, am I going to put in the effort associated with this or not? So that's something that you're going to want to think about. Now, traceability can also help you support reusability, but reusability is another lost art. Traceability and reusability are not really done very often. But if we do our requirements and we structure change in a way that we can leverage traceability and reusability, we can save a ton of time. Okay, so requirements that you can reuse. if you're in a regulated industry, like let's say that you have environmental activity. Environmental activity is extremely regulated. And so the government has some requirements that you have to meet no matter what you're doing. So instead of writing those, instead of when you're working on a change and identifying only those regulatory requirements that are impacted by this change and documenting those and doing that again for this next one, but maybe there's slightly different requirements and doing that every single time, eventually you're rewriting the same requirements. Or remember that thing where we talked about you spend a little time up front to save a lot of time later? This isn't a perfect example of that. So you have these regulatory requirements, you document them up front. And then every project you do, you go ask yourself, which of these requirements do I need for this change? Let me pull those in. Now I'm done. And when you do that, what happens is you save time because now you document the requirement once and then you just pull it in everywhere you need it. Another one is if you are an organization that has contractual engagements with others and you have some specific requirements that have to be met according to that, document them once, reuse them. Quality standards, service level agreements, product requirements, business rules, processes. These are all things that can be reused, especially business rules and processes. Business rules and processes are agnostic of solution, right? So you will have many solutions that impact or are impacted by rules and processes. So document them once and then consume them or associate them. Another requirement type that's not in here that I do all the time is every organization I've ever worked for has some pretty specific security requirements by which I have to evaluate every vendor solution I consider. So I document those requirements once and I consume them every time I need to, right? So those are the value of that is you really kind of need to be using a more best practice approach to requirements to be able to take advantage of reusability. There are some tools out there that are being touted as requirements management tools, but they're not. If it doesn't provide traceability, reusability, things like that, layers of abstraction, it's not a real requirements management tool. It's a work item management tool. So that's something to keep in mind and be prepared to communicate, because if you want really powerful requirements, you're doing reusability and traceability. If you want to have reusability, it needs to be clearly named so it's understood and well-defined no matter where you use them. And again, it's most useful if it's in a centralized repository that has like related tables and stuff like that. You can do it without that, but it becomes painful if you try to do it without that. And another thing we need to think about is what kind of attributes do I want to keep track of? Okay, so these need to be planned for in advance so that you know how to manage them. They're not part of the solution definition. They're just part of how you keep track of or document the requirements. So they're not part of solution design. They're things that help you manage your requirements. For example, the unique ID. So if you're communicating with someone and you've got a project that has thousands of requirements and they try to give you the requirement name, you're like searching forever. But if they give you the specific unique ID, it's really easy to find it. Unique IDs also allow you to do traceability much more effectively, okay? And they do not get changed. No matter where that requirement's stored, no matter how it's used, they don't get changed. Who owns the requirement, so I know who to go to if I've got questions? Who wrote the requirement? You know, so ownership I would go to see, you know, can I make this change to this author so I can go and see why did you write this way, right? Those are some attributes. Some additional thinking on attributes, the cost of a requirement, because that can help you with your cost benefit, your value consideration for every one of them. Who's responsible for maintaining it? How often has it been revised? Where did it come from? What is it traced to, right? What caused this requirement? What requirement is this impacting? Things like that. Some more elements of it that are not listed in this training is like its priority. The priority of the requirement is an attribute. What's the status of this requirement is an attribute. How risky, how hard is this to implement? Those are all attributes that can help us manage, prioritize, process our requirements throughout the life of a change. So here's your summary slide. It gives you the inputs, outputs, all this kind of good stuff. I need to go shut my office door. I forgot to shut that. So I'm going to set down my headset. If you have a question, I'm not going to know until I get back. I'll let you know when you should see me when I get back. But look at this for a second, and I'll be right back for you to ask questions if you have them. Okay, any questions? Okay. I have my favorite. Before the end of our time together, first I have to make sure that I fit all of our conversation in. I need to make sure you get all of the content. At the end of that, so that it can be optional for people, anyone that's not interested or curious about what you just asked can leave. Every time I teach, I wind up showing, there's a really cool requirements evaluation that has been done like every 2 or 3 years. There's a great report on it. It shows you a lot of tools and why they're great, why they suffer, things like that. And then I can also share with you, I've done a requirements management tool evaluation every other year for the last 6 years, and I keep coming up with the same result. That doesn't mean next year will be the same. I don't know, but right now it is, and it's built on IBA best practice standards, and I'll show you what that is too. So I'll share that stuff with you at the end of our training before I pass you off to someone else. You bet. Okay, so last task we're going to cover, and then I'm going to cover a few techniques with you for this specific knowledge area. Performance improvement. So we want to make sure we're doing a good job, right? So we should do plan, do, check, act. What this means is, we execute business, we plan our analysis work, we do it, we validate it was good, but we find ways, this is our lessons learned. So right here is where we hit lessons learned, and then we move on to making improvements before we do the next business analysis plan. So plan, do, check, act. Normal thing, I think it's really popular in like lean worlds and stuff like that. But that's kind of the idea. You want to constantly look for ways to improve. So the purpose of this task is to look at how we're doing and identify ways we can do it better. That's it. It's really that straightforward. The elements we're going to talk about is performance analysis, so analyzing our performance, assessment measurements, analyzing the results of those measurements we've elicited, and then identifying ways to improve. This is a lot like what we're doing is we're BAing our BA work. Okay, we're looking at where we are, asking ourselves how that's working or not, identifying where we would like to be better, and then identifying ways to get there, right? So really, we're doing business analysis on our BA process. So first, we want to identify improvements that we can make. So we should look for improvements through measuring performance, right? We're going to have measurements that we gather, and that could be stuff like how many times did we have to go through peer review? How hard has it been to get approval? How many requirements bugs were found in the QA process? Meaning not that the software didn't perform, but that when the QA person was working through that, they uncovered a requirements weakness, right? Maybe we as business analysts should be thinking if then else, right? If this happens, then we do this. What if it doesn't? Okay, there's an else. Sometimes it's kind of easy to miss the else. That's a requirements failure. So how often does that happen? That's a measurement we can track. And so we get these measurements, and then we take all of those measurements and we analyze those measurements. And once we analyze them, we figure out where are we performing to a level we're not happy with, and so that we act on those results. So we either give ourselves a pat on the back because we're doing great, or, which is what usually happens because we're never perfect, we identify ways we could improve and we act on that. It can be a verbal conversation and really informal, or it could be documented and formal. So we could be in an environment where we just kind of get together and we say, hey, how'd that go? When someone says, that went great, but I think that I need to beef up my understanding of BPMN rules because I think I keep messing that up. Okay, great, let's do that. And then you talk about it the next time. That's verbal, really informal. You could be in an environment that keeps track of all these metrics and actually has a meeting with you and documents the results, and it goes into your performance plan. So that's a really documented informal situation. So it can be either one of those. Okay. When we talk about measurements, Usually they're quantitative, right? Ideally, because that's a lot less subjective, but they can be qualitative. Um, Qualitative is where you can ask people, hey, how did you feel about that BA process? Right? Now, when you do that, that's very subjective to their personalities and their preferences, right? So you could have a situation where the BA gets poor performance comments from consumers or from subject matter experts because that subject matter expert just doesn't like change. It doesn't matter how good the BA is. So while we still want to know that, because it's a measurement that we can determine, are we overcoming that well enough, it's not necessarily fair to hold that business analyst to some of those measurements. If it's subjective, it's subject to feelings. And it's not fair to hold a business analyst accountable for that. But what we can hold them, that's a learning process, right? It helps us understand, maybe I need to approach that one person a little differently. So it helps us, but we shouldn't be penalized for it. Now, what we should be held accountable for definitely is, are we doing what we're supposed to do? Did we adhere to the plan? And if we didn't, did we have good reason and did we communicate it, right? Things like that. How often are we having to change requirements? Now, you could argue that I can't control that my business changes their mind all the time. But if we're honest about it, if I'm asking enough of my whys and what fors and challenging the business, then we should have fewer changes to requirements. What that means, though, is a business analyst cannot be an order taker. They can't be responding with, would you like fries with that, sir? It's not like that. When someone says, hey, I need this thing, we shouldn't be saying, would you like fries with that? We should be saying, why did you need that? And where does that come from? And why did they do that with that? And, oh, would this help too, maybe? Right? We need to challenge them into thinking critically, because most people are not critical thinking when they're solving problem. If they're solving their own problems, they're usually hurting. And if they're hurting, they're usually solving problems with their own biases and assumptions with some emotional involvement. So it's important that the business analyst feel comfortable and confident enough to be polite, but challenge, right? Here's an element that truly can be pure. It's where you have review cycles of peers. Now, review cycles with business is related to this function, this change in requirements. But the number of review cycles, if it's associated with this, same rules that I just said apply. But if you're talking about peer review, where another business analyst looks at it and brings you to an awareness that you've broken rules, right? Maybe you broke process documentation rules, or maybe you didn't write the requirement autonomously enough. Things like that you'll get into with requirements, requirements analysis and design. You'll start talking about what is a good requirement. Those are pretty straightforward. And if you have a peer, another business analyst reviewing your work for quality, and they have to call you on the same mistakes over and over, that's a great way to assess quality or assess effectiveness of the analyst. And then the feedback from stakeholders, again, usually pretty qualitative, and you have to be careful with that information and not hold the business analyst accountable for unreasonable emotional involvement of people. So some possible measurements that you can assess with: how accurate and complete are the requirements? That's probably the number one assessment for us. How knowledgeable is the business analyst of the situation? I temper that because I honestly don't want my business analyst intimately knowledgeable, because as soon as the more intimately aware or knowledgeable I am of a specific situation, the more likely I am to be unaware of biases and assumptions. And when I have those, I am less likely to be more complete and more investigative of what I'm trying to solve for. And I don't know how many times I have asked an obvious question and people go, oh my God, I never would have realized. I would have given you all the wrong requirements. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, right? So that's important. Timeliness is another sticky one. A lot of people measure timeliness, but if you're engaging the BA well and you're doing it the right way and you're engaging them when you should, we're often brought in when we don't know what we don't know, and it's extremely chaotic. And I went through a multi-day estimation class, and I'll get into that later when I teach you some techniques, but estimating business analysis is hard because estimating implies awareness and knowledge, and I'm making an educated guess on something based on that. I ask for investment. I say, you know what, especially early on, give me a couple of weeks of investigating this, and then I'll be able to give you a much better picture. So in 2 weeks, so I give them a deadline. In 2 weeks, I will have this done, and I'll be able to tell you when I think, if I'm ready to give you a true estimate about when I'll be completely done. That's hard to get people used to, but once you get them there, it's a lot easier because you're not constantly making promises that you're constantly breaking. The only time a business analyst can give the only time we can have real estimates on anything is if we've defined something well enough that we understand it well enough to make educated guesses on effort, right? Until then, it's not educated guesses, it's really just a guess, because you never know what's going to come your way. You never know what you're going to uncover. And the only way you can really give confident timeliness or confident time estimates is if you're working on the same stuff over and over again, and there's not a lot of anomalies or not a lot of adjustment that you have to take into consideration. Okay, so you've defined what kind of measurements you want to keep track of, and you've pulled those measurements in. Now we're going to actually look at the data in front of us. So we're going to look at our process and deliverables that we did, and we're going to evaluate them for performance capability. So for example, can the stakeholders read your process models? Right? So if you're doing process model notation really well, it becomes easier and easier for stakeholders to read. How does your boss feel about what you're doing? Your personnel manager, they can give feedback. If you have a center of excellence, if you're lucky enough for that, that's a really great source of what's expected of my business analyst, and are they doing that well? When we're assessing these measurements, we're looking for problem or opportunities in activities of a business analyst that we can improve. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for ways we can do better. We could find out that we're doing great. Okay, great. What can we do even better? We should always be looking for ways to do it better. I know that there's that statement of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Business analysts should hate that statement, and we should not fall into that trap ourselves. So we've got the measurements, we've evaluated them, we're looking for ways to improve. So let's say that we have a tendency to have a lot of peer reviews. How can we prevent that from happening? Okay, maybe we get our business analysts educated better on what is appropriate notation for BPMN, right? Things like that. So ideally, we're looking for things proactively, and we're not waiting for someone to complain. We're not waiting for something to fail. Ideally, we're being proactive. We have a great opportunity for significant impact if we do that. Now, most of the time, we all live in a reactive world where something's not going well. So we have to figure out ways that we can reduce the negative impact of us missing that requirement, or of us causing a delay because we couldn't get the notation right, or things like that, right? This is usually reactive. So we want to live in the preventive world. We often live in the corrective world. So the question for ourselves outside of training is, how do we get to preventive? That's where we want to live, right? So we'll look for those things that we can improve, and we find these things that aren't as great as they could be, or things that are messing up. So first we need to understand why. Why is that happening? Why is that not performing to the level that we would really like to, or that we are capable of? So once we figure out why, now we can figure out how do we overcome that, and we can suggest ways to improve it. Maybe we recommend training of the business analyst. Maybe we recommend education of our people who consume work product from us to help them better understand how to read our stuff. Maybe that's it, right? So we'll make recommendations for ways we can improve what we do as business analysts going forward. Any questions about the knowledge area of business analysis, planning, and monitoring before I share with you some techniques for that knowledge area? Okay. All right, so let's wrap up business analysis, planning, and monitoring with some techniques that we feel are most applicable to this area. Now, again, keep in mind that these techniques can be found in other knowledge areas. What we did is we took all of the knowledge areas and we said, what all of the techniques, and we said, which knowledge area would this technique be most helpful to the students in both understanding the technique and their ability to relate it to a knowledge area so that it can better sink in, right? So the techniques we're going to talk about for planning and monitoring are organizational models. We're going to talk about, we talked about stakeholders, right? So we're going to talk about stakeholder list maps and personas. When we're planning out what we're doing, and remember we talked about when we're uncovering what stakeholders we're going to work with, one of the things that the sponsor told us about something, so we would go to the organizational chart and the processes. It's kind of like functional decomposition helps us look at that. We're going to talk about estimation and scope models. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of these things. Let's move first to organizational modeling. I would expect most of you are very familiar with this. This is just your org charts. It shows who reports to who, and you can kind of derive what they do in the organization because of that. But there are 3 different ways to look at organizational models. Maybe it's functional. If it's functional, that's often where you see the CEO has a CIO and a COO and these other groups, and the CIO has accounting and finance and a couple of other areas, right? And then IT will have development and project management and business analysis and support. And so that's a functional structure of an organizational model. Maybe you have it on markets. So GE has functional model, but it's also functional model within markets. So they actually have a market structure on their organization. And the organization is first structured from a market perspective. And then when you dig down into that market area of that organization, so you'll see GE has big wigs, right? And then that breaks down into the European and the American and all of these other markets. And then you say, okay, I'm going to click on the person who runs this market, and then you're going to click on that person, and that person is going to have underneath them the functional areas of the organization specific to that market. And there are all kinds of reasons that organizations structure that way. The ability to operate in a way where the functions work well because this culture and the financial regulations and other things of a specific market can cause certain structures or certain processes and policies to cause the organization to fail. So sometimes you'll see organizations that are both market and functions. And then you have a matrixed organization, like Google is a matrixed organization, and that's where they're matrixed by product mostly. And so what they do is they have these autonomous groups that are for specific products, and they run on their own. They don't look above them to get guidance on decisions. They run on their own. They'll report up, and then the upper level might give them corrective action, but most of the time they're on their own. And that's where, for like a specific product, you'll have people you'll have an HR you'll have the accounting, the finance groups, you'll have the technology group, you'll have all of those functional groups for that specific product. Okay, and often matrixed organizations are really small, right? So you'll have like 1 or 2 people per functional area, and they all work together. And unless they know what they're doing, and unless they have a lot of enablement in process and technology, it can become chaos. So the strengths of using org charts is that most organizations have them. Most, not all, but most. And keeping it connected to our BA information makes it a lot easier for us to ensure success throughout that change, as well as using it in other related changes in future projects. So because now we have an understanding of how were those functional roles involved in this change, and it makes it a lot easier for us to do stakeholder analysis. Unfortunately, it might not exist. That's a limitation. If it does exist, sometimes it's out of date, especially if it's not tied to your HR platform. If it's something that they manually keep up, it's often out of date. And the other thing it does is it only shows you structure. It doesn't show you the personalities and the relationships in the environment that can cause influence, right? So it doesn't tell you who influences who, it just tells you who is the boss of who. So that's important to think about. Any questions about organizational modeling? Okay, let's talk about stakeholder lists, maps, or personas. Usually you start this by using that org chart, but you start using that org chart and you start creating a stakeholder list. So your org chart is kind of like your map. An org chart is a structure that kind of like gives you a visual perspective, and that's what a map is. So you start with the map and then you start pulling out the actual stakeholders to put them in a list. And what this does for us is it helps us look at these stakeholders in a way that helps us really start to understand them. Because usually you go from map to list and then you pick a couple of people out of that list or a type of stakeholder out of that list and build a persona. And so when you do this activity, it helps you really understand who you're working with. It also helps you understand if you're missing something that can help you, right? If you're missing a source of requirements, if you put it in this visual understanding, you really think critically, which this causes you to think critically, you can identify stakeholders that you wouldn't have normally thought of, right? So it helps you make sure that you're engaging all the right people. And it doesn't mean you engage everybody. It means you identify at least one stakeholder from each type of role that might be impacted to ensure that you get the best picture possible of what needs to happen. Maps. Maps help you in two ways. You'll start here, okay? Usually you start here and you think about, okay, what is the thing I'm changing? What is the change that we're looking at? Okay, what specific sub-department does this impact? What bigger department? How does it impact the enterprise? I think through every layer of this onion diagram. And I should try to find at least one resource from every layer, because that helps me ensure I'm getting all of the right perspectives involved, and it helps me ensure I get much better requirements. Now, once I've gotten at least one person from every one of these, ideally more, now I start thinking about those people. And I start my list, right? I'm going to show you a list screen in a minute, but I start my list and I start asking myself, what about this person, right? I start thinking about what is their role in the organization. I usually think, what is their influence or power? How interested or impacted are they? Those are two different measurements. And I document all of that stuff. Now, once I'm done documenting that stuff, now I can actually plot those people on this influence map. So based on the combination of their influence and power, they're going to fall, their influence and power or their interest, the combination of those values, they're going to fall somewhere on this. This is a lot like that, the Gartner quadrant, right? The magic quadrant. You want to make sure you have someone in this magic quadrant right here, up here. You got to have at least one of these people. If you have people over here, you want to try to get them over there, right? This is the people that have influence or power. And then you're going to have people that are just impacted or not impacted at all, right? So you want someone over here, at least one person over here in show consideration. These are your internal champions that are at that doer level usually. And if you have someone that is impacted but not very interested, you want to get them to the right. So ideally, you're moving your powerful people to the right and your doer people to the right, right? You want as many people over here as possible. That reduces your risk of change and it increases your probability of success. Another element of stakeholder lists, maps, and personas is thinking about the RACI. Now, this can be RACI for the project or RACI for your BA stuff, things like that. But what you want to do is know who is responsible for an activity. Usually, like in business analysis, who is responsible for producing deliverables? Who is accountable that they're done, right? So, or who's accountable for the requirements? Responsible, the business analyst, me, I write it, so I'm responsible for ensuring the requirement is done. Who's accountable for ensuring that it's accurate? That's the person who approves it, right? Who do I talk to so that I can get good requirements? Those are my subject matter experts. Who is informed so they know how to act on those requirements? Those are going to be people that aren't necessarily accountable, but could be influential in helping the project move through to success, right? Okay. So I've gone through my onion diagram, I've made my list, I've plotted them out on how they, where are they in that magic quadrant, and I've started thinking about how are they involved in the requirements process. Now I'm going to pick a few of them and build out personas. So a persona is a fictional character or model that helps me think about how is this person impacted? How are they going to engage? From a business analysis perspective, this can help me plan my activities with this person. We also do these if we're a business analyst working in customer engagement, customer experience, stuff like that. We will do these from that perspective. This is often done in marketing. But a business analyst can help marketing by writing personas. A business analyst can use personas to help us understand how to most effectively engage business or this person in my requirements process. So this has many, many uses. If you're talking about planning and monitoring, you're talking about how am I going to engage this person in the requirements process? How are they impacted by the product I'm building, which is the change I'm working on? If I am a business analyst on a product project, whether it's a physical product like an iPhone or a phone, a cell phone, or if I'm trying to design software or implement software, it doesn't matter. It's about how is this person going to consume that thing from me, and that impacts how I engage them and the questions that I ask them. So personas are very helpful in that. They usually represent real users, and they help us think about we're researching them. And I'm actually teaching this in a sales evolution program, trying to teach some salespeople how to be more thoughtful in their engagement of their prospects. And I'm like, don't just cold call people and say the same stuff over and over and over. Do some research. Don't get creepy about it, but do some research on these people. What are their hobbies? Can you relate to any of those hobbies? That's a great relationship builder, right? Build that relationship so they trust you, so they hear you about the value you want to offer them. Otherwise, you just sound like every other salesperson, right? So personas are really great for that. And that's how you do it. You research people and you think about, you put them yourselves in their shoes. It's really great for us to figure out who should be engaged in requirements processes with us. It really helps us plan how we're going to work with all of these people, the kind of questions that we're going to ask, right? And it helps us understand changes in these impacted groups over time, because as we move through things, our understanding of this can change. The limitations are, and this is what I was talking about earlier, you don't want to build Clydesdales. I know that there's an argument out there for business analysts that specialize in specific technologies or specific verticals or specific functions in a company. But what that does is it causes you to work with the same people doing the same things over and over. And now you're not necessarily going to be as creative in your process. And you're going to potentially skip some stuff because you make assumptions. I'm biased at this. I make assumptions that I know these people, right? And so we're not as thoughtful about things, and we aren't as creative with it. Another limitation is figuring out who has influence and who has interest can be hard, right? Because you got to ask some questions that could be sensitive, and that's risky, especially if you don't save it carefully, if you don't store it carefully, because I mean, if we're honest and we're managing risk well, we are documenting who our our problem children are, right? And that can, if it gets out, that can cause difficulty in building great relationships with people. And it's not like we're trying to call names or be difficult. We're being honest. We're being honest about what stakeholders are a challenge and why, because we want to make a difference. And if we're not aware of that and don't keep track of that and don't try to overcome that, then we can't be as successful. But usually if someone finds out about that and that risk, the risk is you get it wrong, or the risk is they find out and it's not pleasant, right? But they're not going to see it from your perspective about, it's not that I don't like you, it's that I'm aware that you're unhappy about this and I'm trying to mitigate that, right? They won't care about that. So it's very, very important that you're careful about that. Manage that risk. Estimation. Oh, I don't know how many times this gets me in trouble. And I don't mean me giving estimation. I try to buffer the heck out of it, or I just refuse to estimate. What I love is when someone outside of me, like a project manager or a leader or someone like that, says, oh, we're going to do this thing and it's going to take about this long, before ever talking to me. So estimation is just a bear, man. So there are different ways you can estimate. There's top down. That's what I just said. That's where I actually worked at a company that built software for florists and sold flowers. And so the owner would go to the conference every year and listen to everybody and hear pain. And he would promise resolution and promise cool features by a specific date. So by the time I come to the next conference, we're going to have all of this stuff fixed for you. And then he comes back to the office and says, here's your directive. And we're like, there is no way we can get all of that done in this time frame. And so top-down estimation is usually done by people in upper levels, and they're guessing at what this thing will take, high level. And they're usually saying it should take about 6 months, or it should take about 2 years. And they're not saying, I don't know. I mean, we don't know what we don't know, and it could take between this and this, right? So I recommend ranges, especially if you're doing top-down. Top-down should never be shared without a range. And there's a thing called, that's actually really cool and helpful. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. The cone of uncertainty. And it helps you think about, based on where you are in your development process, if people are just now talking and you're in strategy analysis and you are looking at it going, you know what, I think that's going to take about a year, right? So based on my baseline, if I'm in this initial part and I don't have a product defined, like a strategy, I don't have a strategy defined, then I'm going to say it could take anywhere from 3 months to 4 years. And someone would go, good Lord, that's like, are you not more confident than that? No, because we haven't dug into anything. I really don't know. I have a thought in my head about what it might be, but I don't know. And then the further along we get, once we get to requirements, if I still think it's going to be about a year, now I can say, I think it's going to be 9 months to maybe a year and a half. So now I'm narrowing my estimation down. And I took a 3-day, yes, 3 days, class on estimation. I don't know how you can talk about estimation that long, but it was always ranges. Never give a date. Never use the word about and a time frame. Never say, I think we'll be done in 2 weeks, or I think we'll be done August 1st. That's really, really bad to do. Sometimes you can't get around it, depending on the culture you're in, but ideally you don't. And then there's bottom up. This is a lot more accurate. This is where we say, we do a functional breakdown. We say, okay, we need to do this thing. Okay, well, that means we've got to do these 2 things, and this thing means we've got to do these 2 things. And then I say, this is going to take me about this long. This is going to take me about this long. And then it all adds up, right? That is much more accurate. I still recommend a range, but bottom up is much more accurate. Strengths of estimation, it can help us make better decisions as long as we're being thoughtful and controlled on the process. And if you have a team of knowledgeable individuals working together, your estimations are much more accurate, and it's a lot better to set good expectations, build trust, stuff like that. The limitations of this technique is that, and the reason I was saying a range, like that cone of uncertainty, is that if you use the word, if I say to you, pretend that you're one of your stakeholders, particularly higher up, I say to you, I think it'll take, I don't know, maybe 6 months. What do you hear? Exactly. You don't hear my words, maybe, about, you don't hear any of that. You hear 6 months, right? Because that's how stakeholders work. Now, if you say, I think it will probably be between 2 and 6 months, it's harder to ignore a range. So that's not anywhere in your training. That's just me giving you practical experience information. If you just use a single estimation, it can set unrealistic expectations. For example, if all you're doing is you're saying, hey, developer team, these are the functions I need to implement, and they all give you their estimates, and that's what you go with, and that's not necessarily going to be as accurate as if you get multiple people in the room, and then you use the combination of something like, there's several different techniques you can use. There's like Delphi, where everyone privately says how much time they think it's going to take, and then they share it with the group. And then if it's a big range, like 2 days to 4 weeks, they talk about why. and then they do it again and again, and you combine that with another estimation technique, you're going to be much more accurate. Okay, so if you're not careful, it can definitely be inaccurate, particularly if you just use one estimation method. And I don't know about you guys, remember I have a development degree and I love developers, but when I ask a developer how long it's going to take, I increase it by a minimum of 25%, and that's on things that we work on all the time. And then if it's something that's brand new, I double it. Right? Because we are very egocentric beings, humans are, and we want to believe that we can deliver value quickly. So we don't even realize that we're undercutting. I do it. I usually catch myself doing it, and I'm like, oh, no, I should probably add 40% to that, right? Because we give that information with best intentions, and so we don't even realize that we're either we want to feel we don't want them to lose patience, or we want to feel like we're good at what we do, so we underestimate. We underestimate significantly more often than we overestimate. And scope modeling. This is our last technique we're going to cover in this class today. So scope models are high level, and they help us show in a picture what is the scope of what we're working on. And ideally, we do not scope of change, we do scope of solution ideally, because it helps us define what is in and out of scope for both the business analyst and the change effort. So ideally what we do is we do something that is both. You can do in scope or out of scope models. I usually do both. So what that means is when we're talking about the scope, and let's say we're talking about claims management, when I'm very beginning in the process, I will have, I'll have boxes for any of the claims systems. Every system, I'll have a box for that. I'll have a box for the role types, like the claims person, the customer. I will show external stakeholders a little differently than I'll show internal stakeholders. And so I'll put all of that together. And then what I'll do is go through the analysis process. And as we're going through the analysis process in strategy work, where I'm figuring out what is it that we need to change? Where are we? Where do we want to go? What's the difference? When I figure that out, I start figuring out what pieces of that solution scope am I going to have to work on change. And then I take my model and I draw an in-scope line around everything in scope. So now you can easily, in one picture, see what's the solution look like right now, and what are the things that are in that we're going to change. So now I know what's in scope, and by default, everything that's not in scope is out. And it's a really great use for conversation throughout the change process. Now, there are several ways that you can do it. You can do it very, very structured. That's where you have like your decompositions, where you say, here are all the functions in the organization and how they break down, and what they do and what their capabilities are. And then you can highlight the areas that aren't doing well, right? That's a kind of a scope model. You can do that for both functions in an organization and functions of a solution. So functions of a solution, you'll probably call those features, but it can work for either technology and non-technology. Function and responsibility, you can do a scope model that not down to the use case level, but higher up, like use case diagramming could be considered a scope model, but it's not really. True scope models show like the systems of record and the users involved, and the lines are typically processes, and that's that big picture stuff. Scope models are usually big picture, and then you draw the squigglies around what's impacted by what we're trying to solve for. Now, the strengths is it's a really great tool to get agreement on what are we agreeing to work on, and in what time frame are we agreeing to work on that. So it really helps us visualize what we're working on. So it really helps us with estimating the effort. And the biggest thing that scope models give you is what I mentioned before, where I have my solution scope and I draw the squiggly around what has to change. So now I've got justification for in and out of scope, so that when we're in the middle of the requirements process and someone says, oh, I need to do this, and you look at that and you're asking yourself, okay, but I can't see where that falls in the scope, right? And so what that does is that it's the picture saying it's out of scope. It's not you, the analyst. So that makes it easier for you to justify it with less emotion. You're not going to have the emotion. It's usually the person you're telling no that's going to have the emotion. And the other thing that it does is it helps us really think about impact, and it helps us get a lot more complete on that. So if I say, okay, here's the scope and here are the things involved, and I say, okay, I'm going to change this, I can see in that scope everything that that's touching. And I can ask myself, okay, if I change this, does this specific change impact that or that or that? And that helps me much more readily define what is the effort associated with this change. What are all the potential things I might accidentally impact or purposefully impact? Now, the limitations are people might look at a scope model and try to make decisions solely on that, and that doesn't always work because the scope model is not intended to have a lot of detail. It's intended to be a guiding light, not a decision maker. So it's important for us to realize that, and we shouldn't misuse the scope and make it more detailed than it has to be. It could be hard to draw that in-scope squiggly because of politics in the environment that you're in, or possibly contractual obligations. So it might be difficult to pin down in scope. And if we're not careful, we're making assumptions, right? We always make assumptions. And if we're not very aware of that and documenting that and being honest about it, it can be really messy, because we want to be really good at doing this part of it because it sets the stage for everything else. And if we're constantly having to change scope, that means we're not doing a very good job defining what we're working on or why. So that's a limitation of this, is if you're using this alone, it's going to be hard to do that. It's going to be hard to be really good at defining that stuff. So this is only a piece of what we're doing, right? So it's really good about helping us maintain these things, but we have to be aware of these things, these limitations, so that we know that we can mitigate those limitations. And ta-da, that's it for today. Do you guys have any questions about business analysis, planning, and monitoring, or the introductory stuff? Yes. Yes, they are found in planning and monitoring. They are not a complete list of the techniques in planning and monitoring. Something that you are going to want to do is understand all of the tasks in the knowledge areas that will use that. So if you look in your BABOK, you will find a section that says, okay, so we're in planning and monitoring. We didn't cover half of these. Okay, now we'll cover them later. Like brainstorming, we didn't cover it in planning and monitoring because it's actually better in elicitation, right? Right, so you will cover all of the techniques eventually. We just try to choose techniques that are most often used and most appropriate in, from a training perspective, that knowledge area. But you're going to want to study this, and for every one of these, so business analysis, planning, and monitoring has 5 tasks. And every one of those tasks will have a slightly different list of techniques involved. Like, see, this one's much shorter. The governance one, yeah. So that's something you'll want to be aware of. You bet. Any other questions before I tell you what we'll do tomorrow and what to consider for that? Okay, so tomorrow we will be covering elicitation and collaboration. That's a pretty fun knowledge area. The actual knowledge area itself, it does have 5 tasks, but they're actually pretty short. So the majority of tomorrow is going to be about techniques. We will cover a lot of techniques tomorrow. Okay, so that's going to be the focus on tomorrow. That is it for today. If you have a copy of your BABOK, I would recommend that you briefly peruse your elicitation knowledge area before, and think about what we covered today. I went through a lot of stuff really fast, so let that absorb, think about it, and if you have questions, jot them down and bring them up tomorrow before we cover the next knowledge area, because I don't want you guys to wind up covering 4 knowledge areas before you finally ask about a question you had from knowledge area 1, unless the 3rd or 4th knowledge area made you think of it, right? If you have questions, get them out now. Okay. With that being said, I'll see you 9 Eastern tomorrow, and we will wrap up everything you see on your screen right there. You bet. Oh, one other thing before you guys go. Sorry, squirrel. I can't believe I didn't say this before. Okay, I am the person they typically send people to when you call the 800 number, but I can't easily answer that all the time. If you've got a complicated question, you're welcome to call me there. But if you have a quick question, connect with me here on LinkedIn. I do have a lot of connections, but I don't have a ton of messages. So if you've got a question that's pretty quick, message me and I'll try to answer it. Okay? Awesome. Thanks, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day. Thank you.